But very importantly, what they did is they dispatched, at the end of World War I, Kermit Roosevelt, who was the nephew of Theodore Roosevelt. He was assigned to go and search throughout the area to determine whether oil existed. And what they did is they assigned the protectorate among the Allies were in charge of the oil development inside that particular nation state. And so what they would do is that particular nation, the Western Allied power, would establish a private oil corporation. Royal Dutch Shell, for example. The United States had the Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California. They had Exxon. They had British Petroleum. There were 7 major oil corporations that they named themselves collectively the Arab American Oil Corporation, the Aramco. And these 7 oil corporations, they engaged in negotiations with the royal family that they had designated, and they agreed that they would have an exclusive 60-year lease that would run from approximately 1922 to 1982. And that this exclusive lease agreement would authorize the oil corporation that had been created by that allied nation state to develop that oil. And what they would do is they would agree to pay the royal family, not the country, not the national treasury of the country, but the royal family privately. They would pay them anywhere from 6 to 10% of the profits for the development of that oil. And 90% to 94% of all of the profits would be kept by the Allied Oil Corporation, the Allied Nation Oil Corporation. And so the royal families got filthy rich, even on 6 to 10% of the income. But what happened is there's a book called The Prize. And I should have written down to know who the author of The Prize is. Somebody can look it up on your thing here. But there's a book called The Prize, and it's like about a 700-page book. You're not going to have to read the whole thing, probably half of it. No, you won't have to read half of it either. But there's a book called The Prize, and it tracks this history. You found it? Yes, Daniel Yergin. Y-U-G-A-N. Y-U-R-G-A-N. Y-E-R-G-I-N. Look at that. You should have a copy of this book. Whether you get it on Kindle or whatever you want to do. But it's just that part of during your undergraduate years and going on into your graduate school years, you'll start to assemble a certain number of key books that you'll want to have. Many times in the course I just start assigning a few pages out of each one, so you'll have to get it. But I'm just going to recommend it to you that you should get a copy of this book, The Prize, Daniel Yergin's book. It's just like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. You should have that. Because you go to chapter 11 in Howard Zinn's book, The People's History of the United States, and it'll tell you all about the robber baron era. It'll talk all about that stuff. And he'll also talk about this confrontation that went on between who he refers to as the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians at the beginning of the founding of the country. So there's a couple key books like this, and when I hit onto one of these, I'll tell you about it. And there'll be a few others as we go through the course. But what I'm saying is that this event that took place at the end of World War I, in addition to sending out this Kermit Roosevelt to identify where all these oil fields were, and to have the deals made by the Allied countries' oil corporations with the royal family that was appointed by them to govern inside those areas. A second thing happened, and that is that at the end of World War I, the Russian people rose up, as you know. They rose up against Tsar Nicholas II, and they overthrew him as the royalty. It was like the royal family of Russia. It was like the French Revolution, that rose up against the French royalists, earlier. And they threw out the Tsar. They established a People's Republic. And originally, it was fueled by an extremely idealistic vision of having a People's Republic that participated in an egalitarian way in a democratic process that eventually fell prone to being taken over by Stalin and became an authoritarian, centralized authoritarian government. But at the end of World War I, when they threw out Tsar Nicholas, they had this whole period where they had this real idealistic revolutionary process going on. And they declared that their resources inside their territory of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were not going to be available to the capitalists and the corporate capitalists in the oil industry and the people in the West. And they didn't declare war on them. What they did is they said, we're withdrawing Russia from World War I as an ally of the Allies, and we're withdrawing. We're stopping fighting in the war. We're going to set up the Soviet Socialist Republic, and we're going to have this idealistic self-governing process and lay claim to our own resources. Well, what happened is the United States government, the Secretary of State, Robert. I hadn't thought about this for a while. I should have made a note about it. But Robert Lansing. Robert Lansing was the Secretary of State for Wilson, President Wilson, at the end of World War I. Wilson had had a stroke and was incapacitated, actually. And Robert Lansing had risen up to basically start asserting a lot of the powers of the presidency. And he sent a foreign military expeditionary force into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution, allied with what they call the White Russians, who are the European Russians around St. Petersburg in that whole far western section of Russia, that they joined together with the United States military forces and attempted to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. But the Bolsheviks repelled them, so that this antagonism between the people of Russia in the Soviet Socialist Republic actually began with a United States military invasion of Russia in an attempt to crush them, which they don't tell you about. They don't tell you about it. Even in most of your high school civics classes, you can actually take courses at the college level, and they don't tell you about that. And why is that? Because they view it as unpatriotic. Because they somehow view the effort on the part of the government to overthrow the Bolshevik Revolution as somehow having been kind of a patriotic endeavor. But when you found out that Robert Lansing is in fact the son-in-law of John W. Foster, who was the Secretary of State back in 1893 when they moved in, took over the Philippine Islands, took over Hawaii, took over Guam. They were moving out into the Pacific Ocean in this full manifest destiny imperialist venture that they were engaged in. And it turns out that John W. Foster is the grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles having become the first civilian head of the American Central Intelligence Agency in 1952, and John Foster Dulles becoming the Secretary of State. Okay, and what you've got is this elite group of people and families still governing, and they actually utilize the tools of the American government to generate this invasion into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution in the cradle. Just like they had sent foreign military expeditionary forces into Nicaragua, into El Salvador, into like 18 different places that they had sent U.S. military forces, all at the behest of the robber barons, to basically secure resources for them to be able to profit through their corporations. And so that this period that went on, it got worse than that, because what happened is that the same people that you're going to find, we'll revisit this a number of times in the course, that these robber barons organized themselves into a private investment house that was named Brown Brothers Harriman. And it was a big Wall Street private investment firm where there were approximately 50 investors. They included people like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan of the Morgan Guarantee Trust, the DuPonts were there. All the Rockefellers were there with all the oil, and the Chase Bank. That there were about 50 of these families, 40 to 50 of these families. And what they would do is they would all sit on each other's boards of directors. So they had this interlocking set of directors for these different corporations, and they would coordinate their activities together. So that for example, that the railways and the steamships and the cargo ships, would all coordinate with carrying the coal or carrying the oil or carrying the grains, and they were divvying up the natural resources of the country among themselves. And they did this through their law firm. The name of the law firm was Sullivan and Cromwell. And there's another book that you might want to get, and it's called A Law Unto Themselves, or A Law Unto Itself. And it is the secret history of Sullivan and Cromwell. And again, you can find the name of the author there. I'm just sort of realizing it as I'm telling you about all this, as you should probably see that, because it's extraordinarily clear about what it is that they were doing. That these 50 families were just basically running the country, and they were more or less unabashed about it. And that what they did at the end of World War II, or World War I rather, in 1924, the person who was the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman was a man by the name of George Herbert Walker. And the reason that sounds a bit familiar to you is because he's the grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush, George H.W. Bush Sr. And he's the great-grandfather of George W. Bush, which is that's who he is. And this fellow, George Herbert Walker, and that's W. Bush, is W for Walker. Okay? George Herbert Walker, he retired as the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman. I did this quickly in the first lecture, but he went and set up a Union Bank of New York and got the 50 families that were investors in the Brown Brothers Harriman investment house, and they capitalized this bank. And then they set up a foreign subsidiary of the Union Bank of New York up in the Netherlands called the Bank of Shipping and Commerce. And a guy named Fritz Thyssen ran that bank for them. And they financed the entire rise of the Third Reich Nazi Party in Germany. And they built the headquarters. It's all verifiable that they built the headquarters of the Third Reich. And they financed the rise of them as a bulwark against Bolshevism. And they kept using the term Bolshevism to refer to socialism, that the people in the Union of Soviet Republics, they, in fact, were trying to establish a socialist government run by the people all the way up until about 1924. And in 1924, Joseph Stalin rose to power and started transforming that whole experiment into a major authoritarian, centralized power to protect themselves, as they said, against the constant efforts on the part of the Western allies to penetrate into them and get access to their resources. And so this began a dialectical conflict going on between the Bolsheviks, now the Stalinists in Russia, against the Allied powers. And this is that famous Cold War that went on for some 75 years, basically, all the way from 1917 with the October Revolution, all the way up until December 31st of 1991, when Gorbachev signed the edict releasing all of the republics from the USSR. Now, this period is an extraordinarily important period of history to understand. Prior to the Cold War, this whole interregnum period between 1868 and the rise of the robber barons, the generation of World War I, and then this whole period following World War I that goes from about 1918 all the way to the beginning of World War I in 1941. Okay, well, actually 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Okay, but now this is a history, and the only reason that I raise it, and you can have some questions in a minute here, but the reason I raise it is because it's all background to what it is that's going on now. That this conflict that you see happening now is a continuation of this same dialectic that it was going on between the Hamiltonians and the Madisonians. It was later going on between the robber barons and a group that I want you to get a look at. This is a very important piece that, again, you're almost never told about this. But during the height of the rise of the robber barons, from 1868 to 1898, in about 1874, 75, the United Board of Homeland Ministries of the United Methodist Church decided that what the robber barons were doing was not only unethical, it was unchristian. It was contrary to the basic values of Judeo-Christian social teaching. And so that what they did is they decided they were going to, up at their summer resort they had up at Lake Chautauqua, up in northern New York, out by Niagara Falls, they were going to invite everyone who wanted to be a Sunday school teacher for the Methodist Church to come with their spouse and their families for free up to Chautauqua, New York, and spend the summer there at their big summer resort on the lake and learn about why what the robber barons were doing were unchristian and violative of the social ethics of the Judeo-Christian community. And that went on from 1874 to about 1879 for several years. And then they realized that wasn't going to be fast enough. And so what they did, in 1879, they issued an invitation to all high school civics teachers throughout the country to come with their spouse and family up to Chautauqua, New York. And what happened is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came all the way across the country to Lake Chautauqua and flooded the whole place. And they didn't have enough rooms for them. They didn't have enough living space. And so they all started fanning out and living in homes all around. The people all put them up. And they had this huge, gigantic thing that was basically like Woodstock that you've heard about, which is all part of history, I guess, for you guys. But Woodstock was this gigantic, as you know, big musical celebration where thousands of young people came from all around the country up to Woodstock in Massachusetts, and New York is all the way to Woodstock, New York. And for those who were there, right? Actually, I drove right past it and didn't even know what was going on. I mean, I was at Harvard Law School. I was driving home all the way up to Lake George, New York, and I said, what are all these cars doing here? There was like tons of these cars. I could hear this music going. But anyway, but this thing that happened in 1879, 1880, that all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came to Lake Chautauqua, and they started getting trained in understanding what was unethical about what the robber barons were doing. And then they fanned out and went out into the country, into the schools, and then the next year they had regional meetings that all got overwhelmed with more high school teachers. And then it went on, and by the year 1920, there were over 2,000 Chautauqua sessions held in the United States that summer. And the Chautauqua movement became the point of the spear, if you will, of the entire intuitionist movement, that entire Madisonian movement to try to counter the Federalists and the Hamiltonians and the robber barons. And it's an extraordinarily important movement in history. And it gave rise to the women's suffrage movement that generated the 19th Amendment in 1919. It generated the anti-child labor statutes, prohibiting 7-8-year-old kids working in the mines 18 hours a day in the factories, etc. It generated the American labor movement. Actually originated unions and also originated the public school system. Dewey, John Dewey was recommending the free public education for people. Very similar, like free college education they're talking about now, right, in the state schools. Bernie Sanders and the AOC and the rest of the people are talking about it. That what you're seeing here is a potential revision of the Chautauqua movement against the robber barons, represented by Donald Trump and Rex Tillerson and all of these people who are the masters of the oil industry, because it's, as you'll see in the prize, that the oil was the engine of the military and industrial power of this element in the country. And so that their ownership and control of the oil and the monopoly control of the oil, and they of course, what we're going to get to in the course is that the entire thing going on in the Middle East right now, the whole thing is all because George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, the grandson of George Herbert Walker of Brown Brothers Harriman, invaded and occupied the Middle Eastern oil fields at the end of the Cold War. And that's what all of this is that's going on right now. Okay? So we'll unpack that for you, trying to understand what's going on in our world right now with the wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq and now in other countries as well. And the effort to impeach Trump, and this division in the Democratic Party between the genuine progressives and the more moderates. All of this stuff is going to be the warp and the woof of this course that we're going to be talking about over this time, okay? But so what we're going to do Thursday is we're going to review the Mueller report to see what the basic information is that has been made available to the Congress, to the intuitionists, to the college students, to the universities. And what you'll see is it's almost nowhere in the academy, in the universities around the country, are they likely to be studying the Mueller report. But you're going to get to do it. So we're going to get to see what the ammunition is that the intuitionists have to be able to mount against the robber barons in their resurgence here at the end of the Cold War. Okay? Well, no, just the kids. We could talk after. But I ran up against the line. But I only do this in 99% of the time. Okay? But like, if you've got any pressing questions and you don't have to run off to your next class, you can come up and ask me. Yes? There's 10 minutes left. Oh, is it 10 minutes? Oh, good. Oh, good. See, fantastic. All right. So look, I know it's hard to, after getting dosed like this, to think of particular questions, but I would like to have you think of some questions because you should start thinking about your papers. that all of this stuff is going to be pertinent to your papers because there's details of global climate change which are important, but the politics of global climate change are going to be relevant as well. Okay? So if you can think of any great questions, just the student, just the kids. The criminal potential liability, but civil, the whole civil immunity that they have is sort of across the board. That you cannot sue them. You do not have standing to sue them. The corporation is all that can be sued, and you go after their assets. With regard to criminal statutes,
there is like active decisions made with the knowledge that there could be like.
Oh, not only could be, but there is. Yeah. That with full knowledge that it is killing people. Okay. They did it with the car, the Chevy, the Corvair. They knew perfectly well that it was killing people, and if somebody bumps into the back of you, it's going to explode the gas tank and kill you. And they had clear computations as to, well, how many times is this going to happen? How much is it going to cost? How many of them are likely to try to sue us? How many of them can we crush with our lawyers to beat them up back, and we don't have to pay them anything, which they did. And then when we do have to make a payoff, we can keep it secret. They don't know how much it got paid. We don't admit any kind of liability. And the entire civil system, drafted up by the lawyers that are all part of that whole elite, protect them. So the only way to break through is if there's criminal liability. If you can tell, and the problem with that is that most of the criminal statutes require what they call scienter, which is an actual evil intent, an intent to have your action cause the damage that it does. And they seek their defense by saying, well, I wasn't intending it for it to happen. But then if they can get charged with reckless negligence, they say, oh, well, that's a civil standard. And you can't sue me civilly because I have civil immunity. And so that the only thing there is in there is reckless endangerment. It's like as if you're up on an overpass dropping rocks off on cars coming by. You aren't intending to kill anybody necessarily, but it's so reckless, it's reckless endangerment. And that's that area of criminal law that is reckless endangerment. The problem is that it has to be decided by prosecutors who are government officials. And the problem is the prosecutors are elected and their campaigns are paid for by a lot of the corporations. And so they might prosecute some teenagers for dropping rocks on cars going by. They don't prosecute the owners of the major corporations for raping and pillaging because then they won't get their campaign contributions. And it isn't just an individual thing. But my own, I'm the DA and I'm planning to run for the congressional seat like they all do. Every prosecutor you ever meet thinks they're going to be president. That's how they start out. You got to be a prosecutor. Like you have to go and fight in a war somewhere, wherever we're invading, and you got to get that military record. Then you become an assistant DA, and then the DA, and then you become president. Kamala Harris, classic. You watch it. And so the bottom line is that the Democratic Party and Republican Party that decide whether you're going to get the nomination to be the district attorney will tell you not to do the case. Don't prosecute the people in this corporation because they give the Republican Party contributions. And that's the problem with this. The thing has been poisoned at the base with money in the authority to bribe the Congress people and the legislators.
How do environmental regulations and executive actions kind of play into this?
Well, it's interesting. This is one of the important issues that you raise here, because in watching what's happening with Trump, over the years, the Democratic Party has tended to give a great deal of discretion to the executive branch to issue these executive orders. For example, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton issued an executive order back in 97. He issued an executive order in 1997 stating that it was a violation of the Federal Civil Rights Act for an oil corporation or any other corporation that's going to be building a noxious infrastructure such as a waste disposal place, to place that in or near a racial minority community. Because they used to do that all the time. That's what they would do it all the time. And then they would say, oh, well, we didn't really do it because they were a racial minority. We did it because the land was cheaper there. Well, the land was cheaper there because it was in a racial minority community. And so he issued an executive order mandating that, but it has limitations on it, is that he issued an order mandating that any company, any corporation that does business with the federal government is prohibited from building a noxious infrastructure in a racial community. Okay, so there's a limitation on who they can get at under those things, because that has to do with the limitations of the power of the federal government. Okay, because theoretically they don't exist just as a general government in the whole country. The whole idea was to set up a federal government to provide fill in the interstices for the financial and business community that they needed assistance with. And so that they've run over that considerably now. So that you set up an authority in the executive branch to issue benign executive orders to protect the environment, for example. And the problem is Trump comes in and says, let me see all those executive orders. There they are. There's about 100 of them protecting the environment. Let's get rid of all those. Let's just cancel those and then walk around bragging about how we're getting rid of all these cumbersome regulations, freeing up business. Like he just did. He just issued 2 executive orders last week, specifically prohibiting states from negating the authority of an oil pipeline corporation to build a pipeline through their state. And say, well, if they filed the application for the permit and 60 days has expired and the state has not given them the permit, the president can intervene and order them to give them the permit. That was his executive order. Now, the fact that it is transparently illegal, it doesn't bother him at all, because he thinks he's got the courts. And he's got all those lawyers now, all these corporate lawyers that they're appointing now under the Federalist Society to stand on their head, to do anything they can do to contrive some type of an argument to let him get away with this. And that's what they do. There's like they've now, by the time they got to the United States Supreme Court, they allowed him to ban basically Muslim people from coming to the country, even though they struck down the first 2 iterations of it. And he finally, what he's doing is he's packing all the courts. He's packing all the courts now. But remember, the Federalists, in creating the Constitution, gave the authority to the president to nominate federal judges. So they know perfectly well that there's a political consideration, a worldview consideration in selecting the judges. So that this myth that the judges are all completely neutral and they're only governed by the law has never been true. Has never been true. So I'll close with this one, and it's one little aphorism that I've said before, that when we're talking about our country and the condition we're in today, is remember the old Irish aphorism. The Irish refer to Ireland as the old sod. And there's an old aphorism that says, well, the old sod isn't what it used to be, but then it never was. Okay? So things seem pretty awful right now with this kind of blatant confrontation between these morons who say all this kind of stuff just out of avarice and greed, but they've been there ever since the beginning. And so we're in constant struggle with them to try to get them under control. And now the impeachment movement is to try to get rid of them entirely, to condemn them, to strike them from the office for doing what they're doing. And the great advantages that we have an absolute paradigmatic example of a robber baron in the office. There he is. He's a pure model of everything that they stand for. And that's why the Republicans are so afraid. They can't disown him because he represents everything that they stand for. So we have to, and that's why the regular, more moderate Democrats don't want to lose their adversary, so they can keep control within the Republicans and Democrats of running the country. And so there's this, and now the whole third movement, this Justice Democrat movement of AOC and the others, is inside the Democratic Party. They made a tactical decision not to go out into the Green Party and challenge them, but to take advantage of taking control of the Democratic Party. And that's what's going on right now, is that your generation is in the process of trying to take control of the Democratic Party and have it be a justice party. And so that's what this course is going to be monitoring. So we'll take a look Thursday to see what kind of ammunition we've got for the impeachment. Okay? Great, kids. There you go. Yeah. See. Well, I'll talk to you. Okay?
I want to close out the panel by saying one word to my American viewers. Vote.
So, if I hear anybody saying their vote does not matter, then it doesn't matter who we elect. Read up on your history. It matters. We've got to get people to vote.
Don't just sit there, let's get to it. Speak your mind, there's nothing to it. Vote!
And if you don't vote, you're gonna get a spanky.
Hello, voters. Have you voted? Are you on your way to vote? Just get back from voting. Did you vote yet? New phone, you vote?
Welcome to another edition of Propaganda Watch. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and as I'm sure I don't need to tell the American viewers in my audience, yes, of course you've just gone through that orgy of democracy known as the ritual of casting your ballot in the midterm elections, the most important elections of our lifetime. The universe has changed, everybody. Yeah, as I say, I don't need to tell you about the enormous flood of propaganda that you've been consuming for the last few months, really, here, certainly in the past few weeks, about your vote, the vote, get out the vote, it's the most important thing you can do, it's your civic duty, etc., etc., etc. And I'm sure we have all heard that phrase many times before. If voting changed anything, they would make it illegal. But it's actually interesting to follow the threads of that particular quote. A quotation usually spuriously attributed to Mark Twain or Emma Goldman or others, although there is no documentary proof whatsoever that they came up with that phrase. But if you look at the earliest known recorded, printed, published use of that phrase, it actually comes from a letter to the editor of, I believe it was the Lowell Sun from Lowell, Massachusetts, on 24th of September 1976 by... the name is Robert Borden, Robert S. Borden, MD, and it's an interesting little letter to the editor. I will put the link in the show notes so you can go read it for yourself in its entirety, and it's like it's written by a modern-day voluntarist. It's very interesting in the way that it frames the issue of voting. The letter to the editor is actually headlined, "Voting is dishonest and fraudulent." And it says, perhaps the people are grasping reality in spite of the indoctrination we've been subjected to via our schools, media, government, and others who wish to maintain the status quo, that is, the few controlling and living at the expense of the many. That's one hell of an opening sentence, and it could have been penned by yours truly. Moving on, later on it says, has it ever dawned on the editors of the Lowell Sun, evidently, that the attitudes of the 70 million projected non-voters may be very consistent with the reality that the concept of voting and electing representatives is basically dishonest and fraudulent. If voting could change anything, it would be made illegal. There is no way a politician can legally represent anyone because he was elected on a secret ballot by a small percentage of voters. He then claims to represent the people who voted against him, and even those who wisely chose not to participate in such criminal activity. You say those 70 million stay-at-homes will forfeit their right to complain about the way they are governed, but being enlightened, they are perhaps saying they do not want any part of a system where coercion in the form of taxation, which is the taking of property allegedly being protected, and war, which is nothing less than murder, is the sole means of its existence. If you vote and are in the majority, you violate the rights of the minority, or vice versa. The implication is might makes right. It goes on from there. Again, please do read through that letter to the editor. It contains a lot of things that it took a lot of other people many decades to cotton on to. So it's interesting, actually, and I'm glad that that has sort of been enshrined in history in a way, because it is, as far as can be determined, the earliest printed use of that phrase. If voting changed anything, it would be made illegal. But obviously, as you well know, I have been well immersed in World War I and the history surrounding World War I. Actually, for a number of years now, the initial impetus for my World War I documentary occurred to me at least in 2014 at the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. I really was started along the path of, I have to do a documentary on this. Well, here we are, 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, and finally the World War I documentary is rolling out. So I have been immersed in this and thinking along these lines for years now, reading up, dipping in and out of the literature on it, but really, obviously, in the past few months, I've been immersing myself in this. And so it is in this context that I see some of the, there are any number of examples from history of why democracy and casting your ballot is a, if not immoral, although I think it is immoral, but also a meaningless exercise. But let's turn to the history of World War I for some clear examples of that. And I want to pick up on something that, again, because it was just 30 minutes, just one tiny section of one part of the World War I documentary, it goes so quickly you could blink and miss it. But it is an important point that I tried to make towards the end of that first part of the World War I documentary. In retrospect, the machinations that led to war are a masterclass in how power really operates in society. The military compacts that committed Britain, and ultimately the world, to war had nothing to do with elected parliaments or representative democracy. When Conservative Prime Minister Arthur Balfour resigned in 1905, deft political manipulations ensured that members of the Round Table, including Herbert Henry Asquith, Edward Grey, and Richard Haldane, three men who Liberal leader Henry Campbell Bannerman privately accused of Milner worship, seamlessly slid into key posts in the new Liberal government and carried on the strategy of German encirclement without missing a step. In fact, the details of Britain's military commitments to Russia and France, and even the negotiations themselves, were deliberately kept hidden from members of Parliament and even members of the cabinet who were not part of the secret society. It wasn't until November 1911, a full 6 years into the negotiations, that the cabinet of Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith started to learn the details of these agreements that had been repeatedly and officially denied in the press and in Parliament. Again, blink and you would have missed it, but what was conveyed there in those 2 short paragraphs of narration was incredibly important, and backed up by mountains of specific evidence that one could write entire books about. Oh, entire books have been written about this. So, again, I hope you understand the documentarian's plight, trying to summarize literally thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of hard documentary evidence in consumable bites of information that will make sense in a documentary format. But in order to delve into that in a little bit more detail, let's consult some of those sources, some of which I hope you'll be familiar with, some which might be new to you. For example, Lord Milner's Second War, the Rhodes-Milner Secret Society, the Origin of World War I, and the Start of the New World Order, one hell of a title, by John P. Cafferkey, a very valuable resource when it comes to this story. And Cafferkey has a number of very important details and facts in this book that were important for shaping my understanding of this story, or helping me to come to a fuller understanding. And in this book, he quotes Milner himself. Again, Alfred Milner, Sir Alfred Milner, later Lord Alfred Milner, a name that does not resound throughout history. It's not one that most people will even have heard of in this day and age, much to our detriment, because this is an incredibly important figure, specifically in the story of the formation of the compacts that led to World War I, but more generally speaking, in that entire secret society stew that was brewing there in the early 20th century that led to, amongst other things, World War I. But we don't know this name precisely because he eschewed the official positions of political power, the big roles in Parliament, etc. And so, then that's just not an important player in politics, right? No, completely wrong. Again, they want you to concentrate on the people in the positions of power, the political offices that you elect, gang. It's your guy. You are deciding the fate of the country, not political intrigues behind the scenes, secret societies, shadowy cabals. Oh, that's conspiracy theory, folks. No, it's conspiracy fact. And Cafferty quotes Milner here, who wrote in 1893 about why you don't know his name. If I were ever to return to active politics, it will be a very long way ahead, and I am inclined to think I never shall return. I feel that a man can do any amount of good work and be of the greatest service without joining in the fray, can in fact be of greater service because he keeps himself in the background. I have an independent position, a great number of friends, and, I fancy, that sort of influence which disinterestedness can always gives. On the other hand, I am no partisan. My interests do not run on the lines of party, and if I can help, in however small a way, to carry out the objects I have at heart, I do not care two straws how the politicians are labeled who execute them. That's it, folks. That's it in a nutshell. I couldn't have written it more succinctly than Milner himself did here in 1893, describing what he was going to do, and then did. He used both major political parties in the two-state duopoly of turn-of-the-century Britain. The Conservatives, the Liberals, it didn't matter. It was the same monolithic party from the perspective of the plotters who, behind the scenes, were hatching their plots, regardless of whoever was going to be in power. All they had to do was read the political tea leaves, see which way the country was leaning. Oh, they're going to vote Liberal this time. They're going to vote Conservative this time. And make sure that you have key people in key positions to make sure that the policy will remain the same. And again, this isn't even conspiracy theory. This is documented history. You can go to Wikipedia and read about the Relugus Compact. Relugus Compact? I'm sorry. Sorry to my Scottish brethren out there, but I don't know how to pronounce that name. The Relugus Compact. And you can go to Wikipedia and read the official entry on it, where they admit, yeah, this was a secret plot hatched in 1905 by Herbert Henry Asquith and Edward Grey and Richard B. Haldane to basically control the Liberal Party from behind the scenes and kick the leader of the party upstairs to the House of Lords and make him a dummy prime minister. And they conspired with the king in order to do this through their contact in the secret society, Lord Esher. Again, all of this is in the first part of the World War I documentary that you've hopefully seen by now. If you haven't seen it, please watch it by now. But again, all of this is there, but of course it's pretty watered down in the Wikipedia version, of course. I mean, oh yeah, there was this secret plot. Basically, it revolves around this compact, which again we know because they openly wrote about it later on, that they made, again, Asquith and Grey and Haldane made in 1905 to control the party and to basically get Campbell Bannerman either as a either get him kicked out of Parliament altogether or just make sure he's a dummy prime minister, ineffectual. And they were ultimately successful in that plot. And Cafferty writes about that in blow-by-blow detail in a chapter here called the Relugus Intrigue, where he goes through the entire plot and the various parts of it and the documentary evidence about what happened and why it happened. But let's turn to a different source. Again, this isn't all coming from one source. It's just not coming from the mainstream historians that control the narrative. But of course, we're talking about Hidden History, The Secret Origins of the First World War by Jerry Docherty and Jim McGregor. And you'll note that Jerry Docherty is one of the figures interviewed for this World War I documentary. And again, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages on this very subject. Voluminous detail, and that's not even getting into the follow-up, prolonging the agony, how the Anglo-American establishment deliberately extended World War I by 3.5 years. Again, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentary evidence, extremely important part of the narrative that we haven't even touched on yet in this documentary. And, well, more on that later. But coming from this, there's, again, no shortage of evidence that going to the ballot box and casting your vote is not the answer when there are secret groups that conspire behind the scenes to make sure your vote doesn't matter. Now, the specific context of this story is at the end of 1905, specifically December of 1905, the Prime Minister of England, Arthur Balfour, resigns. He resigns as Prime Minister, and the very next month there's an election in which Balfour's Conservative Party is drubbed. It's an absolute landslide for the Liberal Party, the other side of the aisle. People want to change. They want something different. Where have we heard this story before? So, landslide victory for the Liberal Party, led by Campbell Bannerman, who is a pacifist, or at least certainly not interested in the war plot plan of this Milner Rhodes secret society cabal, whatever, Round Table. Again, goes by many, many, many different names. And yes, Round Table didn't come in until 1909, etc., etc. So there's different names, which is part of the problem of even talking about this conspiracy, and I think deliberately so. But anyway, so Campbell Bannerman is definitely not running on their platform, i.e. let's get into war with Germany. And the people pick up on that. And and that absolutely resonates with the people. So at the same time as these ongoing machinations, i.e. the Relugas Compact and their maneuvering behind the scenes with the Committee of Imperial Defense and all of that, the Liberal Party was vigorously campaigning against the country on a promise of peace, retrenchment, and reform. Campbell Bannerman began the campaign with a rousing rally in the Albert Hall. Now you know how many holes it takes to where he denounced war and promised that the liberal foreign policy would be opposed to aggression and to adventure, animated by a desire to be on the best terms with all nationalities and to cooperate with them in the common work of civilization. He added, "We are fighting against those powers, privileges, injustices, and monopolies which are unalterably opposed to the triumph of democratic principles." And these prescient words were further expanded into a vision for his government. "It is vain to seek peace if you do not also ensure it. The growth of armaments is a great danger to the peace of the world. What nobler role could this great country assume than at this fitting moment to place itself at the head of the League of Peace?" And they go on to editorially note, on such a promise, Campbell Bannerman led his party to a landslide victory in 1906. So the people definitely resonated with that message, but that wasn't the plan. That was not the game plan. So the secret elite, the Round Table, the Milner Group, whatever you call them, did actively conspire to get Campbell Bannerman kicked upstairs, made into the dummy prime minister, basically completely made irrelevant, as again, Asquith and Grey and Haldane maneuvered themselves into key positions in the cabinet, and ultimately, of course, Asquith took over as Prime Minister in 1908. Now, that wasn't the end of the intrigue. Again, there's so much more detail here, but I think the key part of this comes, or at least the key part for the World War I story comes later on, where the extent, the scope of the deception and the lies that were done in order to bring about this maneuvering that led to the First World War is eventually somewhat sort of revealed, but in just an incredible, outrageous way. So again, reading from Hidden History, even with pliant and trusted men in the cabinet, the secret elite had to keep their plan for war under tight wraps. Had the public known of their intent to manipulate a war with Germany, the government would have been swept from office. The regular meetings between military strategists from France and Britain that had taken place in secret since 1905, sanctioned by Asquith, Grey, and Haldane, were still only known to a privileged few, but secrecy was not easily maintained. Those in the know were bound to grow in number as the work of the Committee of Imperial Defense expanded. Foreign ministers and diplomats heard unconfirmed whispers or were included in confidential briefings. Newspaper editors and owners had sight of information that was kept from the public domain, but it could not last. By November 1911, sources from different parts of Europe made confident claims that secret deals had been done. Deals that bound Britain to France and Russia through military and naval agreements that were repeatedly and officially denied in Parliament and in public. There was a furious row in Asquith's cabinet on 15th of November when details of the secret meeting of the Committee of Imperial Defense, to which Asquith had summoned both Churchill and Lloyd George, came to the attention of a number of ministers who had not been invited. Lord Morley, himself a very senior minister, demanded an explanation about the joint planning between the French and British general staffs. How had this come about? Who sanctioned it? How could this have happened without the knowledge and approval of the cabinet? What precisely did it mean in terms of international commitments? No matter how much the Religus III squirmed, they could not find an answer to one telling question. If the conversations really did not commit the country to war, why should information be withheld? Sir Edward Grey's lame and utterly insincere analysis of the conspiracy to keep the cabinet in ignorance, as recorded in his official memoirs, meekly claimed there was no reluctance to have the whole matter discussed at cabinet. The only difficulty arose from the thing having gone on so long without the cabinet generally being informed. Apparently, Grey, Haldane, and Asquith had simply forgotten to inform cabinet members in 1905, and never got around to bringing up the issue thereafter. What a pathetic excuse. And there's more examples of that. For example, in the memoirs where Grey complains memory loss. I'd forgotten that I hadn't informed certain people about these types of negotiations. And all of this, again, all of it documented here in excruciating details. Lots and lots of footnotes and documents and references. Incredible stuff. And stuff that really does put the lie to what we're all told. Of course, you just cast your ballot, and then your representatives will represent you, and that will steer the course of society. It's the people in the positions that you have elected that are the real people steering this ship of state, right? Wrong. 100% wrong. And it's not just the British side of this, as we will get into in part 2 of the World War I conspiracy, dropping very shortly on CorbettReport.com. Yeah, it happened in America too. Again, specifically surrounding World War I and the issue of peace. Let's vote for peace, guys. Let's vote for the peace candidate. He'll lead us into peace. He'll make sure we have peace. Oh, wait, yeah, he gets into office and suddenly it's war. It happens over and over and over throughout history. If voting made any difference, they'd make it illegal. As I say, the World War I conspiracy will continue to spill out through CorbettReport.com in the coming weeks, so I hope you will continue to stay tuned as this documentary continues to unfold, and I'm glad that you are on board for this part of the story. It's an incredibly important part, and as I say, I could make half-hour videos expanding on every paragraph of narration in this documentary, but I hope you get the idea. Anyway, please do actually go and check out these sources. For the people who are interested in this history and are interested in actually reading books and actually looking at documentary evidence for these types of claims, these are a couple of good places to start. I have literally mountains of other books here that I'm using in the creation of this documentary, but we'll get more into that in the coming weeks. So, again, stay tuned, CorbettReport.com. James Corbett, thank you for joining me.